Mr. Henry was not like most people in the neighborhood. He was old, quiet, and walked with a wooden cane. His back was a little bent, and his steps were slow, but his eyes, deep brown and calm, had a spark in them, a spark that told stories no one ever asked to hear. Every morning, Mr. Henry would leave his small house at the corner of Maple Street and take a walk to the park. His routine never changed. He would stop by the bakery, wave to the kids on their way to school, and smile at the birds resting on the fences. He even brought breadcrumbs in his pocket to feed them. "Morning, soldiers," he would say softly to the birds, laughing to himself. The kids liked him. "Hey, Grandpa Henry," they'd shout. He helped them cross the road, even when his legs hurt. Sometimes he told them jokes. Other times, he just listened to their stories. He never said much about himself. People thought he was just a lonely old man with nothing much left in life. Mr. Henry always wore the same brown jacket. It was old and had several small, faded patches on it. Army badges from long ago. Some people believed he had served in the military. Others whispered that he only wore the jacket to feel important. No one really knew the truth. No one cared enough to ask. "Poor man," some would say. "Maybe he just wants attention." But Mr. Henry didn't mind. He didn't need people to believe in him. He knew who he was, and more importantly, he remembered who his son was. One peaceful afternoon, Mr. Henry reached the park as usual. The trees danced in the light wind, and the sky was soft and blue. He found his favorite bench under the big oak tree. It was quiet, safe, and close to the duck pond. He sat down slowly, breathing deeply, as if the fresh air was healing his soul. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small old photo. It was a picture of a young man in military uniform, strong, proud, and smiling. Mr. Henry looked at the photo with love in his eyes. His hand gently rubbed the corner where the photo had started to fade. "That's my boy," he whispered. But peace doesn't always last. Two officers in blue uniforms were walking nearby. They spotted Mr. Henry and walked over. One was tall and young, chewing gum. The other looked bored. "You can't sit here all day, old man," the tall one said. Mr. Henry looked up, surprised but calm. "I'm not bothering anyone, just sitting." "This bench is public," the other officer said. "You've been here for too long." Mr. Henry slowly lifted his cane and tried to stand. "I'll go. Just give me a moment." But the young officer grew impatient. "Hurry up. We're not running a care home here," he said, placing a hand on Mr. Henry's shoulder and pushing him roughly. Mr. Henry lost his balance. His cane slipped. His weak knees buckled, and he fell to the ground hard. The photo slipped from his fingers and landed beside him in the dirt. A few people nearby looked, but no one came forward. Some turned away. Others just watched silently. No one helped. No one spoke. The officers didn't pick him up. They just walked off, saying something about lazy old men. Mr. Henry didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply lay there, his hands shaking as he reached for the photo in the dirt. He picked it up slowly, brushing the dust off the face of the young man in uniform. As he sat on the ground, leaning against the bench, he stared at the photo for a long time. The same picture he looked at every day. But today it felt heavier in his hand. He closed his eyes, remembering the voice of the young man in the picture. "Dad, I'll protect you. Always." The wind grew still. The camera, if this were a video, would slowly zoom in on the photo, focusing on the face of the young soldier. His uniform had a small badge that said, "Sniper, Elite Forces." His eyes were sharp, serious, just like Mr. Henry's once were. But where was this man now? Who was he? And what would he do if he found out what had just happened? Mr. Henry sat back up, holding the photo close to his chest. His lips didn't move, but his eyes said everything. Something was coming. Something powerful. And it would begin with this photo. David Thompson sat in his military jeep, gripping the wheel with both hands as the engine hummed smoothly beneath him. His sharp, green eyes scanned the road ahead, his thoughts lost in a haze of memories. The drive back home felt like it had taken a lifetime. 5 years. 5 years of serving in foreign lands, carrying out missions he could never speak of, hiding the scars of his job in silence. He hadn't been home since the day he left. His mother had passed years ago, and the last time he had spoken to his father was over the phone. A short call, brief and to the point. "I'm fine, David. Don't worry about me. Just come back safe." But David had always been more worried about his father than he ever let on. As David drove through the sleepy town, he passed familiar places. The old diner, the high school where he had graduated, and the park where he had spent countless hours as a child. His mind flickered to the days when he and his father would sit on the same bench Mr. Henry now favored. Those were simple days, filled with laughter and stories. Days before David's military service stole him away, before the world grew complicated and cold. But today, as David neared the park, he noticed something different. There were people gathered around, murmuring in small groups. Some stood with their phones out, recording. Others simply stared, their faces filled with confusion and anger. David parked his Jeep and stepped out, the weight of his boots hitting the gravel like the beating of his heart. He was used to feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but today it felt different. Something was wrong. David made his way toward the crowd, and a familiar face caught his eye. It was Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman who lived down the street. She waved him over, her eyes wide with worry. "David, you've got to hear this," she said, voice trembling. "Something happened to your father." "My father?" David's heart skipped a beat. What happened? Mrs. Harper looked around, making sure no one was too close, and lowered her voice. "They pushed him, David. The officers. They pushed your father in the park today." David's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, they pushed him?" "He was sitting on the bench, just like always," Mrs. Harper continued, "and the officers came up to him. They were rude to him, called him slow, made fun of his age, and then they shoved him, just like that." David clenched his fists. "Which officers?" Mrs. Harper pointed across the park, where two young men in police uniforms were standing, talking to a few other people. "Those two," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what's happened to this town. They're getting worse." David didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and started walking toward the officers. His body moved like a shadow, calm, controlled, and silent. The world around him seemed to slow down as he approached them. He didn't want to start a fight. He wasn't sure what he wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the way his father deserved to be treated. As he got closer, the two officers noticed him and straightened up, eyeing him with suspicion. They had no idea who he was, but David could see the confidence, the arrogance, in their stance. "Can we help you, sir?" one of them asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. David's eyes narrowed. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at them, his military-trained gaze burning through them. Then he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, the photo of his father. "You touched this man today," David said, his voice cold and steady. "You pushed him down. You humiliated him. Do you know who he is?" The officers exchanged a quick look. One of them, the taller one, laughed, thinking this was some kind of joke. "Who? The old man? Come on, buddy. We were just doing our job. You know, keeping the park clean." David didn't flinch. He unfolded the photo and held it up for them to see. The faded army badges on the uniform of the young man in the picture were unmistakable. "This man is my father," David said, his voice dropping lower, like the calm before a storm. "And I am David Thompson, Army sniper. If you disrespect my father again, I will make sure you regret it." The officers' faces went pale. They didn't expect a reaction like this. They certainly didn't expect to be confronted by a man who looked as if he could end their careers with a single word. David didn't wait for them to respond. He turned on his heel and walked away, his jaw clenched. But inside, his mind was already working. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to shout. His actions would speak louder than any words ever could. David went straight to the police station. He wasn't sure what he was going to do there yet, but he knew one thing. His father was not going to be forgotten. Not while he still had breath in his body. Back at home, Mr. Henry sat in his favorite chair, his hands trembling as he held the photo of his son. He had heard the whispers of what had happened in the park, but he had not told anyone the real story. He didn't need to. His son would handle it. Somehow, David always did. David's heart was heavy as he left the police station. He had spoken with officers, had filed his complaint, and even demanded an official apology for his father's mistreatment. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be enough. A few words wouldn't change anything. The officers had power, and in his small town, that power could be used to hide the truth. David had seen it before, the way people with authority could twist the story, bury the evidence, and walk away unscathed. His military experience had taught him one thing: when you want to expose the truth, you have to be patient. You have to be strategic. That night, as the sun set behind the small town of Ridgeview, David sat in his father's old study, surrounded by dusty books and old photographs. The walls were covered with pictures of his father's past, a proud man in uniform, always standing tall beside his comrades. David pulled the photo of his father from his jacket pocket and stared at it for a long moment. His father had served with honor. He had earned his medals, his respect. And now, because of his age, he had become nothing more than an easy target for two young officers. David couldn't let this go. Not now. Not when his father had given everything for this country, only to be shoved aside by the very people who were supposed to protect him. The next morning, David woke up early, the sun barely creeping over the horizon. He dressed in plain clothes, no military uniform, no badges. He knew that if he wanted to get real answers, he would have to do this quietly. He couldn't just march into the police station with guns blazing. This needed to be a covered operation. He went to the park where his father had been pushed. The place looked different in the early morning light, almost peaceful. But David could still see the spot where his father had fallen. He stood there for a moment, taking in the silence, his mind working. He needed to find out everything about those officers, where they lived, what they did, what kind of people they really were when no one was watching. For the next few days, David kept to the shadows. He followed the officers, keeping his distance but always watching. He learned their routines, where they went after work, the places they visited. It wasn't hard to find out where they lived. Officers like them often thought they were untouchable, but they were still people, and people left traces behind. David also spoke with the locals, quietly asking questions without raising any suspicions. He found out that the officers had a history of bullying others. Nothing big, just small acts of disrespect that no one ever reported. They were bullies in uniform, and it was time someone made them face the consequences. After a week of gathering information, David was ready to make his move. He had everything he needed: the officers' schedules, their weak points, and even a bit of footage from the park, recorded by a local teenager. The video wasn't perfect, but it was enough to show the moment Mr. Henry fell to the ground. It was enough to make the officers look guilty. David knew he had to act quickly. The more time he spent waiting, the more chances the officers had to cover their tracks. So he made his plan. The next afternoon, David went back to the park, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had brought a few friends from the military, men and women who owed him favors and who trusted him completely. They weren't here to cause a scene. They were here to help him gather everything he needed to make sure the truth came out, no matter what. David stood by the bench, the place where his father had fallen. He could still feel the weight of that moment, the sadness and the anger. But today, things were different. Today, he had a plan. One by one, his friends set up their equipment: hidden cameras, microphones, and a laptop to track the officers' movements. They weren't just going to expose the truth to the town. They were going to expose it to the world. The police department wouldn't be able to cover this up. David stood tall, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This ends today," he whispered to himself. As the officers arrived, just like clockwork, David watched from a distance. They were oblivious to the trap being set. They joked with each other, laughed loudly, completely unaware of the eyes on them. David's heart pounded, but his face remained calm. Everything was set. Now, he had to wait. Hours passed. The officers left the park, unaware that David had everything he needed. They had no idea that their actions were about to be exposed to everyone. David wasn't satisfied yet. The next step would be the hardest part, presenting the evidence to the public. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He had seen how power worked in this small town. But he also knew something else. The truth was on his side. That evening, he made his move. With the evidence in hand, he went to the local news station, the one place in town that couldn't be ignored. He met with a reporter, a young woman who had always respected his family. Her name was Emily. "Emily," David said quietly, "I need your help. There's something the town needs to see." David sat across from Emily in her small office, watching as she reviewed the footage. Her eyes widened as she saw the officers push his father. Then, she saw the part where Mr. Henry fell, clutching the photo of his son. "David, this is wrong," Emily said softly. "We have to show this. We have to make sure people know." David nodded. It's time for the truth." As the sun set over Ridgeview, David knew that the battle was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like he was finally doing something his father would be proud of. He wasn't just standing in the shadows anymore. He was standing for something real, for justice for his father, and for the truth that no one could hide. The sun had barely risen over Ridgeview, but David was already awake. His eyes were sharp, focused, as they always had been in the military. His mind, however, wasn't on the war zones he'd left behind. It was on something far more personal now. The weight of what he had set into motion was starting to feel heavier with each passing minute. He had handed the evidence of the officer's abuse over to Emily, the local reporter, and now the whole town was waiting for the truth. But David knew better than anyone. Exposing the truth wasn't enough. Not here. Not now. There were always people who would protect the wrongdoers, and the officers had already shown what they were capable of when they thought no one was watching. No, David needed to do more. He needed to ensure that this wasn't swept under the rug, and for that, he would have to play it smart. He had learned that the hard way. In the army, the sniper's job wasn't just about taking out a target. It was about being patient, watching, and waiting for the perfect moment. It was about knowing the terrain, the enemy's moves, and understanding the precise moment to strike. David sat in the living room of his father's house, staring at the wall where the old army medals hung. The room was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the house settling. His father's chair sat in the corner, empty. The familiar smell of old books and leather was comforting, yet the silence felt deafening. The phone in his hand vibrated, snapping David out of his thoughts. It was Emily. "David," she said quickly, "the news station is airing the footage tonight. It's going to be all over the town, maybe even the entire county. But the officers, they're not just going to let this slide. You need to be ready." David exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "What do you mean, ready?" "I spoke with some people at the station. The police chief's already talking about handling this situation quietly. They'll try to shut it down, make the footage disappear, or worse, smear your father's name. This could get ugly." David paused, then his voice lowered, full of resolve. "I know. That's why I'm doing this my way. I'm not letting them off easy. Not this time." David knew he didn't have much time. The police chief would be the first to try and bury the story. He would want to cover up the officer's actions, especially now that the footage had become public. David had been in the military long enough to know how things worked when power and corruption were involved. The system wasn't kind to people who stood up for the truth. But David wasn't afraid of power. He had dealt with far worse than this. The plan started to form in his mind, the same way it always did before a mission. Methodical, precise, calculated. He needed to gather more support. He needed to make sure the town knew this wasn't just a one-time thing. The officers had done this before, and they needed to be exposed for their behavior, all of it. Later that day, David walked through Ridgeview with purpose. He visited the local coffee shop, where many of the townspeople gathered for their morning conversations. Some of them had already seen the news, others hadn't. But David wasn't here to talk to everyone. He was here to talk to the ones who mattered. Mrs. Harper, the elderly neighbor who had first told him about the incident, sat at a corner table. She was sipping her coffee, looking lost in thought. When she saw David, her face lit up with a mixture of relief and concern. "David, what are you going to do about those officers?" she asked quietly. David sat across from her, his eyes sharp, his face unwavering. "I'm going to make sure they never hurt anyone again." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I need your help. You've been here longer than anyone. You know this town. If we can show the world what they've done, we might be able to stop them." Mrs. Harper looked around the cafe, making sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in closer. "I've heard things, David," she whispered. "I've heard those officers make threats. They've been doing this for a while, but no one dares speak up. People are scared, but not anymore. You have my support. I'll help you in any way I can." David nodded, a small but grateful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He needed more people like Mrs. Harper. People who had seen the truth, but who were afraid to speak it out loud. People who had been silenced by fear. The next step of his plan involved gathering information. David spent hours meeting with people who had seen the officers' behavior firsthand. He went to the local businesses, the school, and even the town hall. Everywhere he went, people hesitated at first, but as soon as they realized that David wasn't going to back down, they began to open up. He learned that the officers had a pattern of abusing their power. They would bully people who couldn't defend themselves, especially the elderly and those without families. It wasn't just Mr. Henry who had suffered at their hands. There were others too. People who had been too afraid to speak up before, but who now, after seeing the footage, were ready to stand with David. As night fell, David stood by the window in his father's house, watching the darkened streets of Ridgeview. He had everything he needed. The town was starting to stir. The video would be airing soon, and the officers would know that there was no way to cover this up. But David wasn't just waiting for the news to spread. He was waiting for the inevitable pushback, and when it came, he would be ready. He knew the police chief would try to discredit him, maybe even come after him personally. But David had something he could count on: the people of Ridgeview. They might have been silent for too long, but they were awake now. They had seen the truth. The phone rang again. Emily's name flashed across the screen. "David," it started. "The video is live. The whole town's talking about it. People are furious." David smiled, his face hardening with determination. "Good. Let them be furious. It's time to put an end to this." He turned away from the window, his eyes locked on the empty chair where his father had once sat. The silence was heavy now, but David didn't feel it. He was ready for what came next. The quiet of the night was shattered by the ringing of David's phone. He had barely closed his eyes when it woke him up, but he didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. "David, it's happening," Emily said, her voice urgent. "The officers just showed up at the station. They're denying everything. They're claiming that your father is lying, that he staged the whole thing. They're even trying to spin it as him being a threat to them." David's grip on the phone tightened. He had expected this. The officers weren't going to go down quietly. They had power, and they had a way of manipulating the truth. But David wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything he had sacrificed. "Where are you?" David asked quickly, his mind already working. "I'm at the station, but it's not just the police. There are reporters here, and I've been getting calls from other stations. People are starting to question the officers' stories, but the police chief is controlling the narrative. He's putting out a statement saying your father was causing a disturbance and resisting arrest." David's chest tightened. He had known it would get ugly, but hearing the police chief's spin on it made his blood boil. His father wasn't a criminal. He was a decorated soldier, a man who had given his life to serve this country, and now they were trying to smear his name. They weren't just attacking an old man. They were attacking a hero. "I'm coming to you," David said, already moving towards the door. "Stay close. We need to turn the tide." When David arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing, trying to get a shot of the officers involved. The building seemed more like a fortress than a place meant for justice. The police chief stood at the front of the station, speaking to the crowd, flanked by the two officers who had harassed his father. The crowd of reporters listened intently, But David wasn't paying attention to them. His eyes were locked on the police chief, whose smug expression made David's blood run cold. He had to act quickly. David moved toward the group of reporters, his presence commanding. The moment the police chief spotted him, his face hardened. He knew exactly who David was, the son of the man they had assaulted. "David, I thought we'd be seeing you," the police chief said, his voice dripping with condescension. "What, you're here to stir up trouble? This is a matter for the police department, not you." David stepped closer, his face cold and determined. "I'm here to make sure the truth gets out. You can try to cover it up, but it's too late for that." Before the police chief could respond, David turned to the reporters. "You've seen the video, haven't you? The one where my father was pushed to the ground for no reason. It's all over the news. But let me tell you something the police won't. My father served this country with honor. He fought in wars, defended the innocent, and protected the weak. And now, because of his age, you see him as an easy target. You push him, you disrespect him, and then you lie about it. That ends today." The reporters murmured, exchanging looks, some of them already raising their cameras, capturing David's words. The police chief's eyes narrowed. "You have no right to come here and accuse us of." "I have every right," David interrupted, his voice cutting through the air. "You see, the real problem here isn't my father's past. The real problem is how you treat people. You pick on those who can't defend themselves, and you hide behind your badge and uniform. But not anymore. The truth is out, and you can't erase it." David reached into his jacket and pulled out the same photo of his father in uniform. The reporters gasped as they recognized the man in the picture. "This," David continued, holding the photo up for everyone to see, "is my father. He's not just some old man with a cane. He's a hero. And you'll answer for what you did to him." The crowd of reporters exploded with questions, and the officers shifted uncomfortably. The camera lights flashed as everyone scrambled to capture the moment. The police chief's face turned red with fury, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. Emily, standing at the edge of the group, whispered to David, "This is it. The whole town's watching. People are starting to see what you've been trying to tell them." David nodded, his mind racing. This was the tipping point. The officers couldn't lie their way out of this. Too many people had already seen the video, and now they had proof, not just from a video, but from the son of the man who had been disrespected. The truth was unstoppable now. But just as David thought victory was within reach, the police chief made his move. He raised his hand, and two officers stepped forward, their faces hard. "We're not going to stand here and be accused by some disgruntled son," the police chief said, his voice seething with anger. "This man is a threat. He's causing a scene, and he's disrupting the peace. Arrest him." The crowd fell silent as David's heart raced. He knew the chief was desperate. They were trying to arrest him to discredit him, to make it seem like he was the troublemaker. But David wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. He turned to the reporters. "You see this? This is what happens when you stand up for what's right. They'll try to silence you. They'll try to lock you up. But you have to keep fighting. Don't let them take the truth away." Just then, a loud voice cut through the air. It was one of the reporters, standing with a mic in her hand. "Wait," she shouted. "We've just received a statement from the local military base. They've confirmed that David's father, Mr. Henry, is a decorated sniper, and his service records are spotless. They sent us proof. This is not just some old man. This is a hero." The crowd gasped. The police chief's face turned pale. The officers behind him seemed to shrink back as the truth hit them like a tidal wave. David stood tall, a quiet sense of triumph washing over him. The truth had come out. The officers had no choice but to face it now. In that moment, as the reporters sworn to capture every detail, David looked over at the officers. He didn't have to say anything. Their guilt was written all over their faces. The battle wasn't over yet, but David knew that he had won. The truth was out, and it could never be taken back.